In this episode, we take a step that separates casual risk talk from real risk management, choosing what to do about a risk and being able to defend that choice later. With artificial intelligence, AI, it is easy to notice a risk and then fall into one of two extremes, either pretending the risk is not a big deal or treating every risk as a reason to stop using the system. Neither extreme works for long, because organizations still need to get things done and people still deserve safety and fairness. Risk treatment is the set of actions you take after you identify a risk, and the defensible rationale is the clear explanation of why those actions are appropriate for the harm, likelihood, and impact involved. When a system is questioned by leadership, customers, or regulators, the question is rarely just what happened, because the deeper question is why you made the choices you made. A defensible rationale is how you show that decisions were thoughtful, consistent, and grounded in evidence rather than convenience. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. To understand risk treatment, it helps to start with a simple idea. Identifying a risk is not the same as managing it. A risk statement tells you that a harmful outcome could occur, but it does not automatically tell you what the organization should do next. Risk treatment is about selecting a response that reduces harm or reduces the chance of harm, or both, in a way that matches the context. Beginners often assume the best treatment is always to eliminate the risk completely, but complete elimination is frequently impossible, or it removes so much value that the organization will ignore governance and create shadow use. A more realistic approach is to decide how much reduction is necessary to make the risk acceptable, and to do so openly rather than by accident. That decision should also be consistent across similar systems, because inconsistency is hard to defend. When you can explain why one system needs stronger controls than another, you show that risk management is not arbitrary. The heart of this lesson is learning to choose treatments that make sense, then explain them in a way that holds up under scrutiny. A practical way to organize your thinking is to remember that risk treatment is a choice among a small set of response types, even if the details vary. Sometimes the best choice is to avoid the risk by not using AI for a particular purpose, especially when impact is high and evidence is weak. Sometimes you mitigate the risk by adding controls that reduce likelihood or impact, such as stronger review, tighter scope, or better monitoring. Sometimes you transfer part of the risk by using contracts, insurance, or third-party obligations, though you can rarely transfer responsibility completely. Sometimes you accept residual risk because the remaining risk is low enough, or because further reduction would cost more than the benefit and would not materially improve safety. These categories are not complicated, but they become challenging when people rush to a decision without making assumptions explicit. A defensible rationale is what makes the choice explainable, because it ties the response type to evidence and impact. Without that tie, risk treatment becomes a guess, and guesses are fragile. Avoidance is the most straightforward treatment to explain, but it is also the most misunderstood by beginners. Avoidance does not mean being afraid of technology, and it does not mean rejecting AI entirely. It means deciding that a specific use case is not appropriate because the potential harm is too severe, the likelihood is too hard to control, or the organization cannot provide the oversight required. For example, if an AI system would influence outcomes for individuals in a high-impact context, and you cannot demonstrate reliable performance or fair behavior, avoidance may be the most responsible choice. A defensible rationale for avoidance usually includes a clear description of the harm that could occur, an explanation of why available controls are insufficient, and an explanation of why delaying or rejecting the use case protects people and the organization. Beginners sometimes worry that avoidance looks like failure, but it can be a sign of maturity when it is grounded in evidence. It also helps to document what would need to change to reconsider the decision, such as stronger data governance or better monitoring capability. That turns avoidance into a principled pause rather than a permanent no. Mitigation is the most common risk treatment for AI because many systems can be made safer with the right controls, but the key is that the controls must be chosen based on the specific risk pathway. If the risk is that users will overtrust outputs, mitigation might involve requiring human review for certain decisions, improving user training, and adding clear usage boundaries. If the risk is privacy exposure through data sharing, mitigation might involve limiting data types, restricting access, and defining retention rules that reduce how long sensitive information exists. If the risk is drift, mitigation might involve monitoring signals, setting thresholds that trigger reassessment, and controlling changes that could alter behavior. A defensible rationale for mitigation explains how the controls reduce likelihood or impact and why those controls are proportional to the risk. It also explains why the controls are feasible to maintain, because a control that cannot be sustained is not a real control. Beginners should notice that mitigation is not about adding every possible safeguard, because that creates friction that teams will bypass. It is about adding the safeguards that directly address the most credible harm pathways. Transfer is a risk treatment that beginners often misunderstand because it can sound like passing responsibility to someone else. In reality, transfer usually means shifting certain financial or operational consequences, while the organization still remains accountable for the decision to use the system. A contract can require a vendor to meet certain security and privacy standards, and it can require them to support incident response, but the organization still has the duty to choose the vendor responsibly and to limit what data is shared. A defensible rationale for transfer explains what part of the risk is being transferred, what controls the contract or agreement creates, and what risks remain with the organization. It also explains why the vendor relationship is appropriate for the use case, including how oversight will be maintained. Beginners should be careful with transfer because it can create a false sense of safety if people assume a vendor is automatically compliant. Even if a vendor is strong, the organization must still manage integration, access, and user behavior, which can create harm independent of the vendor's promises. Transfer can be a useful part of a broader treatment plan, but it rarely stands alone. Acceptance is the risk treatment that requires the strongest rationale, because it involves consciously deciding that the remaining risk is tolerable. Beginners sometimes think acceptance is the same as doing nothing, but acceptance is only responsible when it is informed and documented. Responsible acceptance means you have identified the risk, applied reasonable controls, and still have some remaining exposure, and you decide that the remaining exposure is low enough or manageable enough to proceed. A defensible rationale for acceptance explains why additional controls would not be proportionate to the risk, and it clarifies what monitoring and review will remain in place to detect changes. Acceptance also depends on context, because what is acceptable for a low-impact internal tool may be unacceptable for a customer-facing system that influences important decisions. Beginners should also understand that acceptance is not permanent, because if the environment changes, the likelihood and impact can change, and the same risk may no longer be acceptable. That is why acceptance should be tied to conditions, such as periodic review and incident triggers, so the organization can revisit the decision without starting from scratch. Defensible rationale is not a fancy phrase. It is simply a structured explanation that makes the decision understandable to someone who was not involved at the time. A good rationale connects the treatment choice to the specific harms that were considered, the likelihood based on how the system is used, and the impact based on who could be affected and how severe the consequences could be. It also includes the alternatives that were considered and why they were not chosen, because that shows the decision was not a reflex. Beginners should notice that this does not require perfect certainty, because perfect certainty is unrealistic with AI. Instead, it requires honest assumptions, clear evidence, and a willingness to revise decisions when evidence changes. A defensible rationale also uses consistent criteria, meaning similar risks are treated similarly unless there is a clear reason to do otherwise. Consistency matters because it is one of the easiest things to challenge when decisions are reviewed later. If you can show that your approach is consistent and based on impact, you are far more likely to be trusted. Another important piece of defensibility is making sure the treatment choice is aligned with the system's intended use and with the organization's risk appetite. Risk appetite is the level of risk the organization is willing to accept in pursuit of its goals, and it varies by context. An organization may tolerate small errors in low-impact internal tasks, but have very low tolerance for errors in high-impact decisions about individuals. A defensible rationale shows that the treatment choice matches that appetite, and that the appetite is reflected in standards, not invented on the spot. Beginners sometimes assume risk appetite is an abstract leadership statement, but it becomes real when it guides treatment choices consistently. If risk appetite is unclear, treatment choices become inconsistent and political, which is hard to defend. Alignment also includes making sure the treatment does not undermine other obligations, such as privacy or consumer protection, because a treatment that reduces one risk by increasing another may not be defensible. Defensibility comes from showing that the decision fits the organization's values, obligations, and tolerance for harm in a coherent way. Evidence is what turns a rationale from a story into something credible. Evidence can include assessments of data quality, results of testing, documentation of controls, records of approvals, and results of monitoring once the system is operating. The key is that evidence supports claims, such as the claim that a control reduces likelihood or the claim that impact is limited by scope. Beginners should also understand that evidence should match the stage of the system. Early on, you may rely more on analysis and limited testing, which should lead to cautious scope and stronger oversight. Later, you can rely on production monitoring and historical performance to refine the treatment choice. A defensible rationale does not pretend early evidence is as strong as mature evidence, because that kind of overconfidence is easy to challenge. It also acknowledges uncertainty explicitly, not as a weakness, but as a reality that governance is designed to manage. When you document what you know, what you do not know, and what you are doing to reduce uncertainty, you create a rationale that is honest and resilient. It is also important to connect treatment choices to accountability, because a decision is not truly defensible if no one can be held responsible for maintaining the conditions that made the decision reasonable. If you mitigate risk with monitoring, someone must own the monitoring and know what thresholds trigger action. If you accept residual risk with a promise of periodic review, someone must own that review schedule and ensure it actually happens. If you transfer risk through a vendor, someone must own vendor oversight and ensure contractual obligations are enforced. Beginners should recognize that accountability is part of defensibility because it shows the decision was not only made but also operationalized. A rationale that describes controls without naming owners is incomplete because controls can decay when ownership is unclear. Defensibility includes showing that the organization can sustain the treatment choice over time, not just at launch. When someone asks later why you believe the risk was manageable, you should be able to point to ongoing ownership and evidence, not just an initial plan. This is how risk treatment becomes an operational commitment rather than a one-time statement. Trade-offs are unavoidable in risk treatment, and beginners benefit from learning to discuss them without sounding evasive. Every control has a cost, which might be time, complexity, reduced functionality, or reduced user convenience. A defensible rationale does not deny trade-offs. It explains them and shows why the chosen balance is reasonable given the harms at stake. For example, requiring human review for certain outputs may slow a process, but the rationale can explain that the slowdown is justified because the impact of a wrong decision is high. Limiting data types may reduce model performance, but the rationale can explain that privacy and trust outweigh marginal performance gains. Beginners should also notice that trade-offs can change over time, because controls can be improved and processes can be streamlined. A rationale that acknowledges trade-offs creates room for future improvement rather than locking the organization into a fragile position. It also helps communicate decisions to teams, because people accept constraints more readily when they understand the reasons behind them. Defensibility is partly about external scrutiny, but it is also about internal clarity that supports consistent behavior. A strong approach to risk treatment also includes thinking about how you will know if your choice was wrong or if conditions have changed. This is where monitoring, feedback, and reassessment become part of the rationale rather than an afterthought. If you mitigate risk by limiting scope, you need a way to detect scope creep, because scope creep changes impact. If you accept residual risk based on stable performance, you need a way to detect drift, because drift changes likelihood. If you rely on user training to reduce misuse, You need a way to detect misuse patterns and address them, because user behavior changes under pressure. Beginners should see that risk treatment is not a final answer. It is a hypothesis about how risk will behave under controls. A defensible rationale includes the plan for checking that hypothesis and for responding when evidence contradicts it. This mindset is what makes risk management adaptive instead of brittle. It also makes it easier to justify decisions later, because you can show that you planned for change and built triggers for review. The last piece is remembering that defensible rationale is as much about communication as it is about analysis. You can make a careful decision and still fail if you cannot explain it clearly to leadership, auditors, or affected stakeholders. Clear explanation means using plain language about harms, likelihood, and impact, and connecting controls to outcomes rather than to technical details. It also means being consistent, so you do not describe the same risk differently depending on who is listening. Beginners should also understand that defensibility improves when decisions are recorded in a structured way, because structured records reduce reliance on memory and reduce the chance of inconsistent retelling. If someone asks why a system was approved, you should be able to point to a documented rationale that connects the approval to evidence and to conditions, not to personal confidence. This is one of the reasons governance emphasizes decision trails and auditable records. When your rationale is recorded, it can be reviewed, improved, and used as a reference for similar decisions, which makes the organization more consistent over time. The core takeaway is that risk treatment choices for AI become defensible when they are selected deliberately and explained with a clear connection to harm, likelihood, and impact. Avoidance is defensible when controls cannot reasonably reduce high-impact harm to an acceptable level. Mitigation is defensible when controls directly reduce key harm pathways in a way that is sustainable and proportional. Transfer is defensible when responsibilities and protections are clearly defined and overseen, without pretending accountability disappears. Acceptance is defensible when residual risk is understood, monitored, and aligned with risk appetite, rather than ignored. Across all treatments, defensible rationale relies on evidence, clear assumptions, consistent criteria, and clear ownership for the controls and conditions that make the decision reasonable. When you can explain not only what you chose but why it was the right choice for the context, you turn risk management into a discipline that can be trusted, challenged, and improved rather than a set of vague statements that collapse under real scrutiny.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.